chapter 31. 1 Samuel chapter 31, and this is the last chapter in the book of 1 Samuel. There is a 2 Samuel, which is a continuation of 1 Samuel in our Bibles, but we come to the end of the first book of Samuel today. So 1 Samuel chapter 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But the armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. We'll leave it there, but you can go and see, if you really want to see the gruesome bits about what they did to Saul and his body and things, you can read on the rest of the chapter, but we don't need to read that. This morning, I've entitled our message, "The Bitter End." The bitter end. It's not the end of the whole story, because we go into the second book of Samuel, but it's the end of Saul's story. It's the end of his life here on earth. And as we come to think about Saul, king of Israel, David, the future king of Israel, and we look at these things, I just want to concentrate on a few things this morning. And the first thing I want us to think about is about King Saul and how he lived his life. You see, as we've read through this book of 1 Samuel, as we've looked at different things, we've seen him have many adventures. We've seen many things happening. And all through the book, we see that Saul had choices to make. We see that Saul had choices to make about what was happening, about how he lived his life, about how he obeyed God. Saul had choices to make. The same as what we do all day, every day. We have choices to make. And how we make those choices is how we live our lives. Because when we make choices, we're making things that will affect our future. And sometimes our choices are really easy, aren't they? Hey, what am I going to have for dinner today? Yeah, that's quite an easy choice. It gets even easier if you've only got one thing in the cupboard. But things like that. We make choices. What time am I going to get out of bed this morning? Well, it depends. For me, it depends on what I'm doing that day. Because this morning it's quite early because I've got a busy day. But come Thursday, when there's nothing generally on Thursday morning, I might lay in for a bit longer. choices. We make choices, but we make big choices as well. And sometimes we make good choices, and sometimes we make bad choices. And as we look at this story of King Saul, as we look at how he became and was chosen to be king of Israel, we see that he starts making good choices. He starts making choices to obey and follow God. And these are good choices in his life. But then when things happen and things start going a bit wrong, when he starts to get into trouble, like when there's a giant of a man there called Goliath calling him out saying, "Come and fight me," then Saul doesn't quite make the right choice. He doesn't make the choice that says, "I'm trusting my God and I'm going to do everything that God asked me to do." He doesn't make the choice that says, "I've got a God who will be with me, who will strengthen me, and who will help me." He makes a choice that says, "Look, I'm quite small and I'm not strong enough to go and fight that man." So he makes the choice to be afraid. He makes the choice to not trust God. And we see in other areas where Saul is asked to specifically do things, like when they're going into battle and Saul's waiting for the prophet Samuel to come and bless them and offer sacrifices to God. Saul doesn't wait. He says, "I can't wait. The enemy are gathering." And he does it himself, even though he'd been asked to wait. He goes against God. He chooses to not wait when God's asked him to wait. He chooses to do it himself rather than wait for Samuel, breaking God's law. And we see in other areas where Saul was told to go into battle against the enemy, and they should not leave any of the enemy or any of the produce or the animals or anything that alive. And Saul chooses to take the animals and the sheep and other things and keeps the king alive despite God's instruction. Saul chose his own greed and needs before God's rules and law. And it's in making these choices that we see Saul and his downfall. Because when Saul made these wrong choices, even though he knew what was the right thing to do, we looked at that last week, didn't we? Saul knew what was right, but he chose to do wrong. Last week we saw how he went and he visited that medium, that witch of Endor. He knew it was wrong because it expelled these people from the land. He knew it was wrong, but he still chose to do it. Our choices not only affect how we live, but unfortunately, Saul's choices affected how he died. You see, Saul's ending was a bitter end. It was an end that brought defeat from their worst enemy, the Philistines. The Philistines were attacking, and Saul went into battle with his sons and his whole army. And they didn't have God's strength with them. And the army was defeated. Saul's sons were killed. Saul was mortally injured. He'd been shot with arrows. And he knew he was dying. But he knew that if he stayed alive and was taken captive, he would be tortured and tormented by the enemy. And so he chose to fall on his own sword. That was the bitter end of Saul. Alone on a battlefield with his sons already killed. Saul met his end. That was the choices he made. But you know, it could have been so different. Because when we look in our Bibles, when we look particularly in I just want to read some verses from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6. And this is Paul talking about his life. And he says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race and have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." You see, Paul says that I have lived my life. I have kept the faith. I have made the right choices. I have trusted God. And now is the final stage, the final thing. As I die, I am going to heaven and going to receive a crown of righteousness. Because he's made good choices in his life and the right choices. Paul was able to say that he had been faithful to his call. He had kept the faith, and he faced death calmly, knowing the reward that he had, knowing that Christ was there waiting for him. As we've looked through and think about this book of Samuel, there's just 3 verses from this book of 1 Samuel that I just want us to think about this morning. And so 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 6 says that when Saul heard these words, the Spirit of God came upon him in power. Saul was listening to Samuel, who told him that he was going to be king of Israel. And he told him what he was to do, where he was to go. Can you remember all that few weeks ago now, where Saul was out looking for his donkeys? And he went to Samuel to try and find out where his donkeys were. It's a long time, it seems a long time ago when we saw this story, and how Samuel was expecting him. Samuel was waiting for him because God had told him that he was going to anoint him as king of Israel. When Saul was anointed by Samuel, the Spirit of God came upon him in power. And Saul, we saw how he went and he started prophesying with prophets and worshipping and praising God. He was filled with God's Spirit and power. The next verse that I really do want us to think about is 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13. And it says, "So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power." The Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. When David was anointed by Samuel, God's Spirit came upon him in power. And the final verse is 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14. And it says this: Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. And here we see the result of the choices that Saul made. When Saul chose to go against God and God's ways, when Saul chose to trust in himself and his own army, when Saul decided to do things and take what he wanted rather than trusting God and obeying God, then the Spirit of God departed from him. And we see the difference that makes in Saul's life. But we also see the difference that makes in David's life. We see how when Saul is filled with God's Spirit, he's worshipping and praising and doing all the things that he should be. But when he turns away from God, when he no longer trusts God, then God's Spirit departs from him. And we get to this final bitter end. At some time, probably in the new year, we'll start looking at the book of 2 Samuel. It's such a great book. And we'll see how God's Spirit helps David to live his life. And how David becomes king of Israel. But as we come close to Christmas, we can see here God's plan for this world coming together. Because from David's line we are told there would be a king who would rule the world, who would be Emmanuel. We are told that Jesus, the Son of God, was going to be born of David's line, born from David's family as King of Israel. So this Christmas time, we can praise God for his great plan for Christmas, working oh so many years before. He knew what he was doing. He knew what was happening. But let's also think about that Spirit of God that came upon Saul and upon David. But Saul lost it by not truly obeying what God wanted. He chose and made bad choices in his life. We need to make sure that the choices we make are good choices. We're going to finish with that. But I just want us to think about that Spirit of God coming down and filling, first of all, Saul and then David, and the difference that Spirit makes. You see, when we have the Spirit of God with us, when we have given our hearts to God, when we have asked him to come and lead us and guide us, he sends his Spirit into our life. When we've repented of all the wrong things that we've done and said we really want to follow you alone, Lord, then he sends his Spirit to fill us and to help us to live our lives. And that same Spirit that filled David, that same Spirit that came upon David, is that same Spirit that can come and help us to live our lives today.